many of you are scientists and that study literature and others. And so I wanted to just make sure that we acknowledge that that is the case. The NCP effort is also cross-cultural. And I just want to stress the fact that I have the pleasure of speaking about this first volume in the NCP series, but it's really Professor Gaillard's brilliance and that of the contributors like Corinne Lepage and many others that make up the contribution of this book. Really, what I brought was not brilliance, but the perspective of someone who only speaks English. All right, so the brilliance extends beyond the substantive matter, but speaking English, French, and Spanish, and then having to explain things to me. So we had challenges throughout this process, but what helped me is that I have experience with cross-disciplinary approaches. My Bachelor of Arts is in physical sciences, and then I went and got a law degree. My father is a linguist. My mother is a psychologist. And my father was raised in the United States, but he studied with the Jesuits, so he learned many Romance languages, and he actually knows more Philippine languages than my mother, even though they both have PhDs. And so my working theory is that it's a skill that skips a generation, the knowledge of language, but we'll see. The other thing is being raised in a cross-cultural home. And so that sensitized me to the fact that there are multiple perspectives, and neither is necessarily right or wrong. They're just different perspectives. And so that was the challenge for me. I developed this appreciation for a multiplicity of perspectives, perhaps complexity, if you will, as was discussed earlier, or this idea of coexisting paradigms. And maybe one quick example that I'll share with you, and Nicole maybe will back me up on this or not. One of the things that stuck with me as a child, I was not that bad of a child, but occasionally we would be disciplined. And with one of my parents, you had to look them in the eye. And while you were doing that, the other parent would scold you because you're not supposed to be looking in the eye. And so for a while, we were like, okay, we didn't know what to do when we were being disciplined. But then we just realized that they just had different perspectives on how to discipline a child and how a child should react in that situation. But anyway, with that brief background, this is the first volume in the series, the collection of the Normandy Chair for Peace. And, it focuses on rights of future generation and making peace with the earth, and in part upon the legal protection of the planet and rights of indigenous peoples, the rights of animals, it shares some success stories and talks about environmental peace building. If we could advance to this was the first volume that it developed out of a symposium that was held in 2017. And I mentioned being invited to serve on the scientific committee for this, but it was all conceived by Professor Gaillard. And this was, I think, maybe I'll just skip ahead to the next in the interest of time. Just like all of you, we had a welcome dinner. And this was the opportunity to meet many of the participants. You can see some of them here. And I hope this is one of the benefits of attending this kind of event, is developing the camaraderie and seeing people, rather than just having a name on a piece of paper, is having that connection to folks. And it's really, this is the first time I met Alan Ware, I think, who is here, and I've had the privilege of working with him in addition to the women who are up on the dais with me. And maybe we can go to the next slide. Yes, so I'm just going to introduce you to the different chapters that are in the book. There are 6 parts to the book. There are 21 chapters. It's almost 500 pages in length. And the parts are explained here on your screen. The theoretical approach, and then a focus on the nuclear industry, and then looking at climate justice litigation, and then looking forward, what other kinds of actions might be taken to protect future generations. And not necessarily, you'll remember what Tony Oposa said, he used the term legal action more broadly than just litigation. And then this new legal question about artificial intelligence or transhumanism. And then finally, the need to look forward. So those are the six parts. The first part includes some framing chapters. You heard reference to Mireille de Montmartre, who Professor Gaillard has described as her intellectual godmother, I think. And she just passed away in February as a tragic loss. She's a brilliant woman. The concept of the windrose in her chapter really, for me at least, embraces the idea of complexity. And it's something that I've always chafed against with my colleagues. They're always asking me to simplify things. You know, you have this pressure to simplify things, but you lose context when you do that. You know, there are lots of dialectical forces. You know, that it's not a black and white or a right and a wrong. It may change with the time, and you need to have the flexibility to look at these things. Edith Brown Weiss, I brought her book with me. Evan and Holly, you know, make sure I don't lose this because it belongs to our library. But this is a fantastic resource. We really wanted to have her here with you so that you could experience with her. Yeah, but she was unable to join us. Okay, she'll be joining us on Zoom, so that will be a treat as well.
Supposed to be here 3 days ago.
And the next chapter, Professor Robinson, there are several of his students who are here. You had the opportunity to listen to him. I tell my students, if you ever have an opportunity to listen to Professor Robinson, take it. He is just incredibly intelligent and in so many ways. He can finish my sentences easily. He is brilliant in law. He's brilliant in poetry. He's brilliant in so many things, just a wealth of information. He organized the Sierra Club chapter from New York that participated at the Stockholm Conference in 1972. I think he's the only person I know who actually attended that conference. And I could spend the rest of the day talking about the things that he's done. So one of the things that's spoken about in this chapter is the experience of the Haranasi, the indigenous peoples of New York. So that kind of stressing what you've heard earlier, that these values that we're speaking about have been held for centuries by peoples whose views have been denigrated. Christopher Sudol will speak a little bit about the doctrine of discovery and the roots of that activity. So maybe, so I just had an image for those, but we'll talk about the next chapter. So there's the nuclear industry, and Alan Ware you'll hear from, and so I won't take too much time. But Jean-Marie Collin also talked more, so there are two people who are very heavily involved in this issue. Alan Ware, the Right Livelihood Award winner, and then Jean-Marie Collin and his compatriots who've been recognized with Nobel Peace Prize for their efforts. And so understanding that issue is very important. Frédéric Le Marchand is a catastrophist. Whenever I mention that to other people, they look at me a little bit strangely, but it's thinking about catastrophe and how the philosophy of catastrophe. He's also a very accomplished jazz musician and a sailor as well, so I'm looking forward to reconnecting with him. And then we had some scientists, Doctors Martin Walter and Andres Nideker, who were talking about the building on this idea, not necessarily endocrine disruptors, but their research, so bringing scientific research to a policy audience. This was one of our challenges. There are definitely differences in citation practices for scientists and lawyers and other policymakers. So we had to make some decisions in presenting this information, and we hope it's clear. So you see some of the individuals in the photo. I like to include photos in there for people, even just for fun. That's Frédéric Le Marchand on his boat. And Alan had introduced me to a gentleman who created the Peace Trail in Prague. If you ever go to Prague, I encourage you to Google the Peace Trail and then follow that. Okay, leading up to I'll just skip through. Yes, thank you. So we have Christian Hugo, who we mentioned before, the legal partner and husband of Corinne Lepage. And so presenting the climate justice litigation from a global perspective. I'm going to just check my time here. Okay. Elizabeth Brown, John Davidson, and Danny Noonan, who were the first two were then affiliated with Our Children's Trust. So the folks from the United States recognize the Juliana versus United States litigation that has gone up to the Supreme Court and back down, is now back at the trial court. Youth that are challenging our government's failure to take action on climate change. And John Davidson is a scientist, I think, one of the institutions in Oregon, who was one of their experts, and so they contributed a piece about the efforts of our Children's Trust. Agnès Michelot at the University of La Rochelle here in France, who also coached a team in one of our most recent Opposa Intergenerational Moot Court that was held virtually, talking about the French perspective on climate litigation. And so I'm just trying to give you a quick introduction to the book. It's available to you, and it is a valuable resource. So you can just see, you might recognize the venue. I think we were here in this same room. No? Oh, no, that's where we were, Agricole. Credit Agricole, yes. Okay, so the fellowship is nice. The meals in France are... I should have remembered the moules frites from that picture. Okay, so the perspective of future legal actions on behalf of future generations. So Dr. Hermite is really looking at the how you frame these questions, looking at the rights of nature, issues of legal animism, and this sense that the rights of nature are and of future generations are converging as the law evolves. Matthias Patel, a PhD student, delves into the rights of nature a little bit more detail, looking at the philosophical, economic, and legal contours, and then looking at principles of ecological justice. What are the ecological limits that nature imposes? Attorney Juan Ignacio Pereira, who's from Argentina, and so he was in some of the pictures earlier, and shares with you some of the developments, the legal developments in Argentina, including descriptions of some of the case law that has developed there. And then myself, I spoke with Emily before this about what contribution I might make to the volume, and so I speak a little bit about the issue of GMOs. And I also talk about links between Native Hawaiian cultural values and this intergenerational equity framework. And so we can talk a little bit more about those indigenous issues and how they relate to the topics that we've been discussing here. Basically, there are gaps in the United States federal regulation of GMOs, and there are gaps in the state regulation of GMOs. But then the legal process, something called federal preemption, the courts did not allow the counties. There was some discussion about the importance of going to the cities because that's where the action is, right? Think globally, act locally. But our courts did not allow the counties to address the regulation of pesticides, even though there were gaps in the federal and state legal frameworks. Anyway, I don't want to take too much time, so Professor Michel Prieur has been referenced, definitely an incredible influence on the development of the law internationally. He's talking about a different development than what our previous speaker addressed, the Third International Covenant on the human right to a healthy environment. And that document, that draft has been deposited with the Human Rights Council in Geneva, and it's available, and it's included in the book, so you have that resource available. And then you've heard from Corinne Lepage. She and Professor Gaillard contributed a chapter which details the contributions of the Declaration of the Rights and Duties of Humankind. Okay, quickly moving on to the fifth part. And we have Christian Bick, if I remember correctly, is a jurist and has a judge. I mix up the terms all the time between different jurisdictions. Yeah, thank you. And so we're starting to look at these questions of transhumanism and looking at what are the implications and what are the legal frameworks that address the efforts to improve ourselves. And Louise van der Lack was also mentioned earlier, addressing these questions at a very high level and participating in many international conferences, looking at the issues of artificial intelligence. There's so much more to be said about all of these authors. Amandine Cayol, I had the pleasure of meeting here with Professor Gaillard, and their work is criticizing. There's an ideology around transhumanism, the Singularity University. It almost feels like a cult sometimes if you hear them discussing their ideas. But they in this chapter or part criticizes that ideology as an echo of Nazi ideology, and it calls for a new legal humanism that starts with recognizing crimes against the human species as a principle of human dignity for human generations. Okay, and then part 6, we close the book with a piece from Professor Gaillard looking at the need to protect the future of the future. Right? We are jeopardizing our future, and so we need to be looking carefully at new legal and ethical approaches to ensure that we have a future. And then the Tony Oposa himself closes. I was just asked to introduce him, and so I described some of the amazing things that he's done in his life, and that you heard from him. He shared just a small part of the amazing. He's faced many challenges. He nearly died as a young man in a fire. And then he just recreated himself. I talked with some of the students about Philippine Supreme Court Justice who encouraged him to seek a master's degree in environmental law. So he went off to Harvard and got his LLM there and has been recognized. I think he was the class speaker when he was at Harvard. Very charismatic man and inspiring man. And he shares some of his poetry in that book. And I don't know if you noticed, but the images on his slide, that's his artwork, and he just started painting. So he basically is encouraging all of you to make a difference, and so it takes all of us to get involved. If he were here, he always makes his audience stand up and sing with him and or read out his poetry aloud. But I will not pretend to be Tony Oposa. So, right. But we're getting very close. I think we were scheduled to start our lunch at 12:30. I am happy to end, but if there are any questions, since we have Professor Gaillard here, she will answer all of them.